Kevin Ryan has vigorously contributed to advancing the scientific and material evidence relating to the destruction of the World Trade Center. He has served as co-editor of the online journal 9/11 Studies and is co-author of major studies of demolition evidence published by that journal and by the Open Journal of Civil Engineering, the Environmentalists, and the Open Chemical Physics Journal. Links to these and to more than 36 other articles and numerous videos that he has published in the course of his wide-ranging 9/11 research can be found at the website www.ultruth.com. Kevin Ryan offers us a sterling example of courage and integrity in defense of the integrity of science. His testimony today will focus on, quote, inadequacies of the reports by the National Institute of Standards and Technology. Mr. Ryan will give testimony and respond to the questions of the panelists until 4:15. At the end of this session, we will move directly into the audience question and answer period. Will you please help me welcome Mr. Kevin Ryan?
Thank you, Professor Witt, and thank you all for being here today. I've got a shortened version of my talk, why the NIST World Trade Center reports are false. Basically, it's about why they're false and unscientific. So today I will discuss evidence related to the official investigations conducted by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST, whose reports comprise the final official explanation for what happened at the World Trade Center on September 11, 2001. Before we get to the reports, however, let me mention that the first pertinent point to consider is the low probability that the only 3 instances of a skyscraper suffering global collapse due to fire occurred all on the same day in the same place. There have been many raging building fires, much worse than existed in any of the World Trade Center buildings, but no global collapse has ever resulted from those fires. The U.S. government, has told us that it was the fire that destroyed all 3 buildings at the World Trade Center. We can see from these photos that the towers appeared to have exploded, starting at the top and then going all the way down. Also, high-velocity bursts of debris shot out from 10 to 30 floors below the collapsed front. At the top of each tower, the debris appeared to shoot upward and outward as much of the solid structure turned to dust. This is counterintuitive to the idea that the building was being crushed downward. Some large steel column assemblies were shot outward for hundreds of feet. Many of us have asked ourselves, is this what it looks like when a building is softened or weakened from fire? Independent investigators, including myself, have done much work over the years to determine the answers. In that time, we've published peer-reviewed scientific articles on various subjects related to the destruction of these buildings. Here's one of these papers called 14 Points of Agreement with Official Government Reports on the World Trade Center Destruction. I'd like to begin with this agreement today and show how this agreement leads to the unsolved problems that so many people have seen. Wherever you see this green check mark, it's another point of agreement. One of the points of agreement is that all 3 buildings fell at near freefall acceleration. A question NIST tried to answer was, how could the World Trade Center towers collapse in only 11 seconds and 9 seconds, speeds that approximate that of a ball dropped from a similar height in a vacuum? And we independent investigators agree that the buildings came down essentially in free fall, and this is an important starting point. This violates 2 fundamental laws of physics, one being the law of conservation of momentum and another being the law of conservation of energy. The first law means that hundreds of thousands of tons of material in the cold lower section should have slowed the upper part of the building simply due to the mass of the lower section. The second law requires that deformation of the lower section would consume energy, slowing the fall even more. So there must have been deceleration or slowing. But the upper section, which appeared to be nothing but steel and dust, fell freely in each case. We also agree that the fires in the buildings, whether driven by jet fuel or office furnishings, could not have melted the steel structure. NIST made the point that in no instance did they report that steel in the World Trade Center towers melted due to the fires. The melting point of steel is about 1,500 degrees Celsius. Normal building fires and hydrocarbon fires generate temperatures much lower than that. NIST reported maximum upper layer air temperatures, that's air temperatures, of only about 1,000 degrees Celsius. In other words, diffuse hydrocarbon fires such as these cannot produce temperatures high enough to melt steel. Unfortunately, many prominent media and political figures have suggested that very thing and continue to do so, including the alleged perpetrator Osama bin Laden per the United States State Department, who said, "I was thinking that the fire from the gas in the plane would melt the iron structure of the building." It's difficult to understand that Lee Hamilton, the 9/11 co-chairman, also believes, in the 2006 CBC interview that David Griffin mentioned, that the jet fuel melted the steel superstructure. The leading presidential candidate in the United States of the Republican Party believes that jet fuel melted the steel structure of the building. It's important to realize that the towers were designed for airliner impacts. John Skilling, the structural engineer in charge, said that in the event of an airliner impact, quote, the building structure would still be there. And we agree. So the question is, why did a total collapse occur? A professional animator has helped me create a few little clips to demonstrate for this presentation. So each tower had 236 super strength steel box columns making up the perimeter wall, and this was built around a core of 47 massive steel columns. The floor decking ran between in a staggered arrangement. To reduce the effects of fire, all of this steel structure was coated with a spray-applied fireproofing material. Before the buildings were occupied. And in the aircraft impact zones, this fireproofing was upgraded in just the few years before 9/11. Another point of agreement among all parties is that the theory that was claimed to be the most probable root cause for many years, called the pancake theory, in which the floors pancake down upon each other, is no longer supported by NIST. It's really no longer supported by anyone. And since 2004, when my former company did test models of the floor assemblies, the pancake theory has no longer been viable. The fire resistance of tall buildings like those at the World Trade Center is ensured through testing of samples prior to construction. My former employer, Underwriters Laboratories, tested and certified the fireproofing used in the World Trade Center towers, as seen in this quote from the company that manufactured the fireproofing. UL also tested the steel components used in the towers. This was well known due to a letter sent to the New York Times in 2002 from UL's fire protection manager, Tom Chapin, with whom I was in contact. Tom wrote, "The World Trade Center stood for almost an hour after withstanding conditions well beyond those experienced in any typical fire. In that time, thousands of people escaped with their lives. the important point, ASTM E119 and UL's testing procedures helped make that possible. UL tested the steel components used in the World Trade Center towers to meet the 1968 New York City Fire Code. That meant that the column assemblies had to withstand 3 hours of intense fire, and the floor assemblies had to withstand 2 hours of intense fire in a test furnace. And of course, the biggest problem with this is that one of the towers failed in 56 minutes. Here's the fellow that told me about this testing, Loring Knobloch, who was the CEO when I worked there. He later wrote to me and a few others saying, "We tested the steel with all the required fireproofing on it, and it did beautifully. As we do not do follow-up service on this kind of product, we can give only an opinion on the test sample, which was indeed properly coded, and we tested the code requirements, and the steel clearly met those requirements and exceeded them." And as I said, UL later participated in the NIST World Trade Center investigation, which was a clear conflict of interest. The NIST World Trade Center report is over 10,000 pages. It was originally published only for the towers in 2005, and like previous reports on the subject, it was focused only on the fire-induced collapse hypothesis. NIST made no real effort to examine the explosive demolition hypothesis. Here's the structure of the NIST report for the towers. This does not include the 2 sub-reports issued 3 years later for World Trade Center Building 7, and I will discuss those in the second half of my testimony. NIST's stated goals were to explain why and how World Trade Center Buildings 1 and 2 collapsed after the initial impact of the aircraft, and why and how World Trade Center Building 7 collapsed. The scientific tests that NIST performed to reach its conclusions included tests to determine gas temperatures, tests to determine steel temperatures, tests to determine the possibility of floor failure, tests to determine the possibility of fireproofing loss. Unfortunately for NIST, none of the tests it performed supported its conclusions, as we will see. NIST therefore based its entire explanation on computer models. A summary of what NIST found was as follows. The aircraft severed columns, loads were redistributed, fireproofing was widely dislodged, high temperatures weakened columns and floors, floors began to sag, sagging floors pulled exterior columns inward, causing them to buckle. Instability spread around the entire building, and then they simply said global collapse ensued. We'll examine each of these steps. The first step in this sequence was that columns were severed. Again, it's agreed that the core columns were massive and over-designed, and the perimeter columns were made of super strong steel. But NIST now admits that 14 to 15% of the columns were severed in the World Trade Center towers. This is compared to original design claims published in the Engineering News Record when the buildings were first announced. They said that one could cut away all the first-story columns on one side of the building and part way from the corners of the perpendicular sides, and the building could still withstand design live loads and a 100-mile-per-hour wind from any direction. What that means, in essence, is that the towers could lose 25% of their columns, and they'd only lost 14 to 15%. The second step in this sequence was that the gravitational load was redistributed among the remaining columns. NIST said that loads on some columns were decreased, and on other columns they were increased up to 25%. Again, original design claims said that live loads on these perimeter columns can be increased more than 2,000% before failure occurs. The third very critical step in this sequence was that fireproofing was, quote, widely dislodged. NIST said the towers would not have collapsed under the combined effects of aircraft impact and the subsequent multi-floor fires if the insulation had not been widely dislodged or had been only minimally dislodged by airliner impact. As said before, the steel structure was covered with a spray-applied fireproofing material. There were requirements for the fireproofing to have a certain bond strength, and those requirements were met. In the center and right photo below, you can see how the fireproofing was applied to the columns and underneath the floor assemblies. The test that NIST performed to establish the critical fireproofing loss involved a total of 15 rounds from a shotgun at steel plates and bars. Here you can see photos from the NIST report of the results of these tests. But NIST did not explain how a Boeing 757 airliner could be converted into many thousands of shotgun blasts, which would need to be pointed in all directions to shear off the fireproofing. So again, let's take a look at what that might look like. The plane comes in and impacts the building, and then is converted into many thousands of shotgun blasts. Again, there's supposed to be fireproofing on this, and there's not. But we assume covering the whole building. A real serious problem with this is NIST provided to us the energy requirements. And too much energy is required for this. Previous calculations by engineers at MIT had shown that all the kinetic energy available from the aircraft impact was consumed in breaking the columns, crushing the floors, destroying the aircraft. And NIST had tests that showed that 1 megajoule was required for every square meter of surface to shear off the fireproofing via this shotgun blast effect. That's more than 6,000 square meters of column, floor deck, and floor joist surface, according to the NIST report. That would be several times more than the entire kinetic energy available from the aircraft impact. So too much energy required. NIST 4-step requires large masses of steel columns and floors to be heated to temperatures that would make the steel soften or lose a great deal of its strength. But the NIST report says that the gas temperatures in the towers were only as high as 1,000 degrees Celsius. It does reference steel temperatures as high as 760 degrees Celsius, but the temperatures given by NIST, first of all, do not support their conclusions, and the physical tests, as we'll see in the next slide, that NIST performed resulted in even less agreement. With the physical tests for the steel temperatures, NIST's stated goal was to estimate the maximum temperature reached by the available steel. NIST accomplished this by selecting steel samples from an enormous amount of steel and by emphasizing regions of impact and fire damage in the selection process. They did 2 tests. The first was a paint deformation test, a fairly unusual test that they developed for this purpose, in which they tested painted steel samples over a range of temperatures and then compared the samples they had to that calibration curve. The result was that the samples from the World Trade Center had reached only a temperature of about 250 degrees Celsius. And again, that's much lower than the temperature needed to soften or melt steel, much lower. They did another test of steel microstructure, which showed that none of the steel samples had reached the temperature of 600 degrees Celsius. So again, these tests did not support NIST's hoped for conclusions. A point of agreement between NIST and independent scientists is that the fires in any given area were of short duration. NIST claimed that the fires migrated around the core of the building over a period of time because that's where the fire load was. It was not in the core of the building, but in the office areas in the perimeter. For the North Tower, this migration time lasted 1 full hour, according to NIST, before the fires reached the south wall. So the plane hit the north side of the building. The fires migrated around to the south wall, as you can see, from top to bottom. This left us less than 45 minutes in the failure zone and the south wall. So I'm going to look again at a video here to show you what this theoretically looks like. The plane hit the building, fires rose up. NIST says the fires died down. Explosions do that, they consume the oxygen. And then over time, the fires rose up again and began migrating around the core of the building. It took a whole hour for that to happen, leaving 45 minutes of fire time at the south wall. Now, NIST claimed that the south wall then bowed inward from the fires there, but we might ask why the east and west walls, which had seen as much fire time, why they didn't show any bowing. It could be that something else was happening at the south wall. The fifth step in this sequence was that the floors began to sag. My former company, UL, participated in the NIST investigation by conducting tests on models of World Trade Center floor assemblies to examine the floor response to fire. The result was that only very slight sagging occurred in the tests and no collapse. After 45 minutes in a high-temperature furnace, all 4 test models sagged only about 3 inches in the middle, and the major joist parts did not sag at all. NIST computer model turned this into 42 inches of sagging with the joist bending down severely. To reiterate, UL and NIST built and tested exact replicas of World Trade Center floor assemblies. Here's a photo of one of those floor assemblies after the standard method ASTM E119 was performed. During this test, it was held in a furnace at a temperature over 1,000 degrees Celsius for a period of 2 hours. You can see the slight effect. The midsections of the assembly sagged a few inches, but the frame was not damaged and the floor held its load without failure. The weight loaded was twice as great as what was known to have existed in the World Trade Center. These experiments were performed on 4 separate floor models, all of which had less fireproofing than was known to have existed in the World Trade Center on September 11th. If the sagging had been severe, as in the computer model, what would have to happen to make the sagging floors create these dramatic pull-in forces as NIST requires? Sagging floors, for one thing, do not weigh any more than unsagged floors. But to defeat the original design claims, over 30 columns would have to be pulled in. And the floors were known to form this intense staggered grid with the columns, the way it was constructed. And the force required to pull a perimeter column inward within that grid and overcome that was far greater than what a sagging floor assembly could provide. Even within NIST computer models, the sagging and pulling effects that NIST explanation depends on were not seen. Not even for the most severe cases examined. Here are several quotes from the NIST report that make that fact clear. Sagging of floors in such a wide range over fire floors was not predicted by full floor model analysis. Locations and magnitudes of pull-in forces were not accurately simulated. Pull-in forces were applied in some locations where the full floor analyses did not predict the development of such behavior. NIST was simply not able to demonstrate this critical pull-in effect. Physical tests were not done, although that would have been decisive. The computer models did not indicate these forces either. And as a result, NIST made some fraudulent changes to the scenario. All the fireproofing was stripped off a large section of the computer modeled building, and exaggerated temperatures were applied for twice as long as NIST had said occurred in the failure zones. That is, they applied exaggerated temperatures for 90 minutes instead of 45 minutes. But even then, the pull-in forces were not created in the computer. So NIST did something completely paradoxical. It disconnected the floors before applying an imaginary pull-in force. So again, that's how they overcome the grid. And let's take a look at that. So NIST in their computer model, this is an animation. The floors were heated up, they sagged, they still wouldn't pull in, so they disconnected the floors, and then they applied a pull-in force. You see, this is the opposite of science. This is not anywhere near science. No physical test done. The computer models did not give them the answer they want, so they do something completely fraudulent, which is exactly what they did. The final step of NIST's sequence for the towers was that instability caused by the perimeter columns pulling inward spread around the entire perimeter of the building. This would be necessary to explain the perfectly uniform fall. Again, no tests of any kind were performed to confirm this instability spread. And for several reasons, it does not appear to be realistic. The buildings fell at near free fall acceleration, so the instability would have to fit within that time frame. If we give it only half a second of the time, then this instability spread is moving at nearly twice the speed of sound. That's not realistic. It's not shown in the photos. But again, building professionals, they're aware, they've been aware for years that a steel structure does not collapse suddenly when attacked by fire. There are unmistakable warning signs like large deformations. So let's review some of the key tests that NIST did perform and see how the results were used. They asked what were the steel temperatures, found that they were 250 degrees Celsius, and then plugged 760 degrees Celsius into the computer. They asked if the fireproofing was widely dislodged, and their unrealistic test really showed that it could not have happened for that area of the building, and the fireproofing was entirely removed from the computer sections. They asked how much the floors could have sagged, and after 2 hours in the furnace, they sagged 3 inches, and in the computer, they sagged 42 inches after less than an hour. They asked if pull-in forces could be created. They're not produced in the computer. They did no physical tests, and they simply disconnected the floors and applied imaginary forces. And again, just to be clear, the task was why and how these buildings collapsed. And they stopped at the collapse initiation and did not explain the dynamics of the building collapse at all. So some of the evidence that they ignored when they ignored the actual collapse dynamics include the resistance of the structure below. If each floor caused only a half a second of hesitation, as you would think, an extra 40 seconds would be needed. They have these squibs coming out. They ignore that when they don't explain the collapse dynamics. They ignore molten metal, which you'll hear more about in the next few days. They ignore intergranular melting and sulfidation found on the steel by the earlier investigation done by the Federal Emergency Management Administration, or FEMA. And I just, in my opinion, this is my opinion, what objective scientists would have found, relatively few columns were lost on impact. Remaining columns had considerable extra capacity. Fireproofing could not have been widely dislodged. Steel could not have softened or weakened at the temperatures found. Even at higher temperatures and longer periods, tests showed minimal sagging of the floors. Forces were simply not produced to pull the columns inward, and instability spread would take much more time and would not result in uniform free fall. So finally, for the towers, the NIST report is false because NIST did not explain why and how the buildings collapsed, and the investigation was deceptive and unscientific. NIST reported findings that were in direct contradiction to the physical testing performed. This is what I was fired from my job for stating. NIST omitted or distorted many important facts. Now I would like to examine the NIST report for World Trade Center Building 7, the third building that collapsed on 9/11. Although we should look closely at the final NIST explanation, and we will, it's also informative to recognize that the previous government investigation reported by FEMA provided a best hypothesis that all agreed had only a low probability of occurrence. This building was 47 stories tall, was not hit by a plane, and yet at 5:20 in the afternoon on 9/11, it fell vertically and symmetrically in 6.5 seconds. After 7 years of waiting, NIST finally put out its official report on Building 7 in 2008. No one could have predicted the sequence of events that NIST says led to this building falling. It says that normal office fires caused fully fireproof steel beams to fail in one area of the building, and that's what led to this entire structure falling as it did into a neat rubble pile. To reiterate, the official story of the collapse of Building 7 is that a typical office fire caused this 47-story building to fall in a matter of seconds. If we were to accept this NIST World Trade Center Building 7 report, we would have to conclude that no tall buildings are safe from the possibility of total unexpected collapse due to office fires. All parties have agreed that the start of the collapse of World Trade Center Building 7 was very problematic. FEMA said the performance of Building 7 is of significant interest because it appears the collapse was due primarily to fire rather than any significant damage from the collapsing towers. And NIST said this was the first known instance of the total collapse of a tall building primarily due to fires. They appear to be ignoring the towers. The low probability hypothesis that FEMA described was that diesel fuel fires, driven by diesel fuel tanks located within the building, created intense fires that caused the collapse. And for years, NIST promoted that diesel fuel fires hypothesis as well, but NIST abandoned that hypothesis in its final report. NIST said diesel fuel fires did not play a role in the collapse of Building 7. NIST also suggested for years that the damage caused by falling debris from the North Tower was a root cause of the collapse of Building 7. Ultimately, NIST gave up on that hypothesis as well, saying other than initiating the fires in Building 7, the damage from the debris from North Tower 1 had little effect on initiating the collapse of Building 7. And contrary to some media reports, the building design was not an issue either. One serious problem was the destruction of evidence. The U.S. House Committee on Science reported that in the month that lapsed between the terrorist attacks and the deployment of the FEMA team, a significant amount of the steel debris was removed from the rubble pile, cut into smaller sections, and either melted at the recycling plant or shipped out of the U.S. Some of the critical pieces of steel were gone before the first FEMA team member ever reached the site. This is in violation to our national standard in the United States, at least, for fire investigations, which says that it is essential to prevent the destruction or removal of evidence. Another serious problem is that NIST was stumped for years. Now, they told us in 2006 that their lead investigator, Shyam Sunder, told New York Magazine that he didn't know. He's had trouble getting a handle on Building 7. There's a problem here because the new Building 7, which is taller, built in the same site, was completed in 2006. You would think they would want to know what happened to the first one. And 2 years later, they said they did know. They said it's no longer a mystery. The same man, Shyam Sunder, the lead investigator, it's all about science, and the obvious stares you in the face. So we'll take a look at NIST's final theory now and discover for ourselves whether or not it's obvious, but we should remember that it's entirely computer-based, NIST did no physical testing at all to support its Building 7 report. I've given the panel copies of my presentation. You can find the NIST reports at this link, at this URL. You can check all of my references. But again, no physical testing was done for Building 7. It's entirely computer-based. Here are the basics of the NIST explanation for what happened to Building 7. The fact is they're saying that fire-induced thermal expansion of the floor system surrounding column 79 led to the collapse of floor 13, which triggered a cascade of floor failures. In this case, the floor beams on the east side of the building expanded enough so that they pushed a girder spanning between two columns, and this caused the girder to walk off its seat. You'll see more in detail. But basically this, here in the lower left, you see a diagram of a beam from the NIST report pushing a girder off its seat. That caused the whole building essentially to collapse.
Excuse me, can you explain where column 79 is located in the building?
Yeah, I think I have a diagram for that, and I'll be able to show you here in a short while. Here's a photo of the area showing the critical column 79, that NIST says was affected by the displaced girder. NIST says fires on the northeast corner of floor 12 heated the ceiling that included the floor beams for floor 13, causing thermal expansion of the beams. That is, the beams, the floor beams, here, were heated and they expanded and they pushed this girder off its seat. NIST said that column 79 then buckled due to loss of support from the girder, and the whole building collapsed in a matter of seconds. Here's a diagram showing NIST's view of how the floor beams on the northeast side of the building, shown here as purple lines, pushed against the critical girder. The girder connected column 79 to the external wall at column 44. The girder to column connection is blown up in the inset diagram, showing how NIST envisions that the girder was pushed off its seat. On the bottom here, you can see pictures that NIST used in its media presentation, more simple pictures. When it unveiled its final report. The picture's reversed again, but you can get the idea. An important point here, when we're talking about floors and the beams below them, is something called shear studs. The NIST interim report from 2004 said that most of the beams and the girders were made composite, or one piece, the floor and the beam, one piece with these studs. In a deceptive turnabout, in their final report, they said that no shear studs were installed on any of the girders. Unfortunately for NIST, it's not just its own 2004 interim report that contradicted this vital aspect of the final theory. The presence of shear studs on all the girders was also described by John Salvarinas, the project manager for Building 7, from the company that supplied the steel components. This diagram from an academic paper that Salvarinas wrote in 1986 showed that there were 30 shear studs on that critical girder. And for the question about where column 79 is, it's right here. NIST claims that thermal expansion caused the breakage of over 100 bolts, high-strength bolts. The mechanism that NIST claims caused all this damage is called differential thermal expansion. This is when the expansion of the beam below is much greater than the expansion of the concrete's floor slab above it when they're both heated in a fire. Thermal expansion is not a new phenomenon, as NIST suggests, but has been a consideration throughout the history of structural design. You can see that point made here by two building professionals from Australia who wrote a response to NIST on its Building 7 report. These building professionals reported that they had actually done physical tests to see what thermal expansion would do to floor assemblies. These were just the kinds of tests that NIST should have done. Because they had actually done the test, the Australians were able to state that the shear studs would not fail, because in a building fire, the floor slab would be heated as well, and the entire composite assembly would expand together. The concrete coefficient of expansion is very similar to that of steel. They would expand together at the same rate. So NIST's final theory is at odds with actual experimental evidence from the testing of real floor assemblies. Another thing we need to understand is just how far that girder would have to be pushed for it to walk off its seat, as NIST suggests. NIST reported that the girder seat at column 79 was 11 inches wide, and therefore the girder had to be pushed at least 5.5 inches, or half that distance, to walk off its seat. You can see that claim here in an excerpt from NIST's report. To repeat, NIST's initial failure mechanism for Building 7 was that the critical girder was pushed 5.5 inches by the floor beams. The 5.5 inches was needed in order for the vertical web of the girder, and therefore the center of mass of the girder, to move off the seat, theoretically. Because thermal expansion is a function of temperature, we need to know what temperature NIST says the beams reached so that we can estimate how much they expanded. This was a tricky question for NIST, because at temperatures as high as 600 degrees Celsius, the steel will lose some strength and stiffness, and therefore not be able to extend into the girder. At the same time, if the temperature is not high enough, there wouldn't be enough expansion of the beams. What NIST settled on was just in the area of the northeast corner of floor 12, the beam temperatures reached 400 degrees Celsius. On the lower part of this slide, you can see an example of just how tenuous NIST computer models were with respect to reality. NIST computer models had all the steel heating to extreme temperatures and all the bolts and other connections breaking within a matter of about 2 seconds. This is an example of how NIST computer modeling was not realistic. Once the temperature distribution for its theory was settled, NIST found a way to suggest that the differential thermal expansion could be possible, at least in the computer. They simply didn't heat the floor slab above. And this is what most scientists might call fraud. If you don't heat the floor slab, of course the beam's going to extend in differential expansion. But NIST theories has more problems than that. Given NIST temperature scenario, the amount of expansion by the beams would not satisfy the amount of expansion that NIST said was required, or 5.5 inches. NIST provided an example of the equation that NIST scientists use to calculate thermal expansion. When we put the correct values in the equation, we see that the maximum expansion would be only 3.3 inches. And as we already know from NIST, 3.3 inches would not be enough to cause the girder to walk off its seat. We know that the girder would have had to be pushed at least 5.5 inches for NIST's very improbable scenario to even begin. Another thing NIST said was that there were 7-hour fires in Building 7, which gave the impression that the fires were very long and very hot. But early photographs did not show fires on floors 11 through 13, where NIST says the first failures occurred, until after 2 p.m. And the building fell less than 3.5 hours later. So there could not have been 7-hour fires in those areas. Underwriters Laboratories provided the fire resistance information for Building 7 as well. There were requirements for fire resistance of the columns and floor steel in Building 7, just as there is for any skyscraper. The requirements were that these steel components had to withstand 2 to 3 hours of intense fire in standard tests. One big contradiction that NIST avoided is that its investigators knew that the fire load in the building would only support about 20 minutes of fire in a given area. When the NIST report talks about several hours of fire, it's deceptively talking about the time that a fire lasts anywhere on a floor, not in one specific location. Underneath a floor beam, for example, the fire time is only about 20 minutes, as this exchange from a NIST advisory committee meeting indicates. The NIST advisor, Charles Thornton, asked, fire moved every 20 minutes. Essentially, it started and stopped every 20 minutes. So if you do not have fuel in Building 7, how could fires burn for as long as they had and taken out this major structure that had good fireproofing? Good question. And the lead investigator, Shyam Sunder, essentially admitted, yes, the fire moved from location to location every 20 minutes. And while the combustibles were being consumed, the fire front would continue moving to adjacent combustibles. So 20 minutes of fire in any given location. Another problem that NIST did not explain is that the fires on floor 12 were completely burned out at least 30 minutes before the building fell. And it's well known that steel cools quickly after a source of heat is removed. We should be able to verify how long the fires lasted in a given location because there are photographs available from various times during the day, but it turns out that NIST did not use the photographs to verify its computer simulations. You might think I'm not being honest here, but it's true. As you can see from this comparison of a photo in NIST report, taken at about 4 p.m., and the NIST simulation of fires on floor 12 at the same time, there is no correlation between NIST simulation and what really happened. At approximately 4 o'clock, NIST computer simulation shows raging fires across the north side windows of floor 12. The photo from the same time shows no fires in that area at all. NIST admits that its models did not use the observed fire activity from the photos and videos as a model input. Again, this is not science, and this is another example of why the NIST report is false. There are significant problems with NIST's description of the collapse dynamics as well. One problem is that the computer model output does not match what we see in videos. As you can see here, NIST computer model suggests the building crumpled from the sides before falling. Another problem is that NIST has admitted that Building 7 fell at free fall acceleration for a period of time, and that simply cannot occur without the structure below being removed by some unexplained forces. This problem will be covered by physicist David Chandler on day 3 of these proceedings. But to sum up, why the NIST World Trade Center 7 report is unscientific and false is that no physical tests were done to confirm the NIST explanation. The fire hypothesis is contradicted by known fire resistance plans. The fire in the building lasted only 20 minutes in a given area, while the steel components were rated for hours of fire resistance. NIST's final theory was based entirely on computer simulations that are not based on evidence. NIST fire modeling contradicts the photographic evidence. The fires in the critical areas were out long before collapse. NIST did not heat the floor slabs in its model of differential thermal expansion. NIST ignored known facts about shear studs on the critical girder. The maximum thermal expansion possible could not have caused the girder to walk off its seat, and this computer result does not accurately model the collapse. Regardless of the fact that the NIST World Trade Center 7 report is false in many ways, we'd like to see how NIST reached its conclusions. But we're not allowed to see those things. Structural engineer Ron Brookman, a colleague of mine, made a FOIA request to NIST in 2009 asking for the calculations and analysis behind the claim of girder walk-off failures. NIST responded that the release of that information might jeopardize public safety. That's the response. Another question that I have is has NIST work on the subject been taken seriously with respect to building design and construction? As I said, the new taller Building 7 was completed in 2006 at the time that NIST lead investigator was saying he didn't know, he had a trouble getting a handle on Building 7. But also NIST recommendations that have been adopted by the International Building Code Council do not relate to the causes of the destruction that NIST cited for the World Trade Center towers and Building 7. So finally, I would just say again that NIST produced World Trade Center reports that are false. They did not explain why and how the buildings collapsed, and the investigations were deceptive and unscientific. NIST reported findings that were in direct contradiction to the physical testing performed. NIST omitted or distorted many important facts. They will not share the results with the public, and therefore, an important point here, these results cannot be independently verified as required in science. And NIST explanations have not been taken seriously by the building construction community. So thank you.
Thank you, Kevin Ryan. Before we move into questions from the panelists, if I could, I want to make a quick comment. We very much appreciate the cordial interaction and discussions between witnesses and audience. Yet we need to remind ourselves, and you as well, that it's most respectful to witnesses to wait to speak and to ask questions, as it were. You should have received, I believe, some sort of card or have available a card. Speaking from my own experience, my questions only get better as I wait to write them. We are very eager to have those collected and addressed at the end of this day and every day. Thank you very much for your support. Panelists, we may proceed as we have. A question? Okay, I think Professor Lee was up by a hair.
Okay, thanks. Thanks once again, Kevin Ryan, for an excellent, detailed presentation. There's many issues I'd like to go over, and I hope to get a second and third kick at the can before our questioning is over. You mentioned at the very end that the engineering, the construction community doesn't take NIST's conclusions seriously. That is a really interesting proposition, because it suggests that there's a garage door that's wide open for some serious skepticism and serious inquiry. So could you say a bit more on how does a serious structural engineer go about their daily business knowing that the trusted agency of the federal government is full of it?
Well, that's probably a better question for a structural engineer. I'm a chemistry laboratory manager, not a structural engineer.
Okay.
But yeah, I have looked at the recommendations that NIST has made, and those few that have been adopted by the International Building Council. And for example, some of them talk about strengthening the stairwells, reinforcing the concrete, and those are not things related to how the buildings collapsed. So I believe that structural engineers are continuing the way they always have.
Yes.
In terms of fire resistance, they consult Underwriters Laboratories, and they get information on how long steel components will last in a fire, and that hasn't changed. And it's a good question for structural engineers. I think it should be brought up to them. I don't know if there are any in the room today. I know there are several other types of engineers today, but I'll have to defer that question.
But if I could just comment further, it suggests that the catastrophic collapse of these three buildings has not affected the construction going forward, construction methods going forward, which is a kind of startling revelation.
Yeah, you would think that there would be a remediation program in place around the world right now, very seriously. If the World Trade Center Building 7 report is accurate, because it was, as the advisor said, office fire, attacking fully fireproof steel components for a short period of time, really. And there are buildings around the world regularly having office fires. And we weren't worried about coming into this building today. Hopefully, we won't be worried about going into other buildings. But there should be, if this is true, some sort of remediation program to retrofit buildings, existing buildings, as well as design and construct new buildings.
Oh, thank you, Professor Lee. Professor Johnson.
I've had a little experience working in my early career in structural engineering, and one thing about structural engineers is that they are, in my experience, scrupulously honest. Either it stands up or it doesn't. And you have to respect the mathematics and the calculations that you make to make a building sound and withstand all the forces that would be brought to it. I'm almost embarrassed for the NIST engineers, I have to say. They were given an assignment which was in which apparently they were asked to come up with a preordained solution to or preordained story, and that's not the way we should proceed in analyzing an event of this kind, obviously. You've done a wonderful job of demolishing many of the assumptions and assertions made by NIST. Where do we take these assertions or these doubts that you've raised in our mind? Where should we take these now? Is the National Academy of Engineering a place where we can ask for verification? What objective engineering venue would be willing and able to do an objective analysis of the facts and opinions that you've brought here?
Well, I believe there are many that we could approach, and several that we have approached. I'll just give you a little feedback. We have a team of us, including myself, Attorney Gurley, 9/11 family members, Professor Jones, Richard Gage, gotten together and submitted a request for correction to NIST. This is a formal process based on the Data Quality Act in the United States, meaning that a public agency that produces a report like this must produce data that's useful and data that's reliable. And if they don't, they can be approached, as we did, with a request for correction. So we put together a very detailed request for correction, explaining all of the problems, many of which we've talked about today, and others as well, and saying these things are clear, you need to correct your report. And so the response was basically short and sweet: we don't agree with you, point by point. No, we're sticking with our original story. So then we put together an appeal and submitted that via the Data Quality Act. The next step requires quite a bit more funding. That would be actually filing a lawsuit against NIST. So none of us are wealthy, but if we find the source of funding to hire the attorneys to do the work, we could do that. But we are regularly approaching agencies and societies. For example, as a member of the Board of Directors of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, I wrote a letter to the Royal Society in England in June because our president was there giving presentations in England. And so I very politely wrote to the president of the Royal Society. His name is Sir Paul Nurse. And I said, Sir Paul, there are several historical figures in your society that would be offended by this NIST report. One of them being Sir Isaac Newton. Because several of his laws have been violated. And explain this in a letter. Sir Paul did not respond to the letter, unfortunately, did not go to the presentation. But that's the kind of thing that we try to do, always reach out to people. And I think the legal action through the Data Quality Act is still a viable option, but we need funding. And then approaching Union of Concerned Scientists, for example, just regularly and objectively approaching them, I think could help.
Thank you, Professor. Other questions? Professor Jenkins.
Yes, this may not be the right time to ask this question, but from what you know of the way these buildings collapsed, if they were brought down by demolition, by explosions, would both the perimeter columns and the central columns have to be cut at roughly the same time? Would a destruction of the central core be adequate to give the results that we see in these videos?
Again, that's a question best answered by a demolition expert or perhaps a physicist. But as I understand it, in classic demolition, which this appears to be more of a classic demolition, from what I understand, the core of the building is attacked first so that the building will implode, will fall inward on itself. And you can see that to some extent with this. If you see at the top, there's a penthouse that indicates that the core of the building did fail first. And then the rest of the building came down. But it's a timed sequence of explosions, as I understand. Very, very difficult thing to do. Takes planning. And it's not simultaneous, but close, I understand. So that perhaps we'll have another speaker in this proceeding that can answer that question better.
Just one more question, please. In the case of the Twin Towers, you report these explosions which appear to be at the edge of the buildings, and the result of which is hurling out debris at high speeds laterally. Presumably, am I right in thinking that that would have to point to explosions at the periphery of these buildings, not just at the central part?
Yeah, that would be my guess as well, but that would be
All
speculation.
right. Thank you very much.
Yes, one question. Do you think that should be possible an expertise in order to establish the cause of the collapse of Building 7? Expertise with many experts in chemical engineering and other aspects, because you have tried to individuate the cause, but it seems that you have not individuated. No. So we have to try to ask the expertise, and you can prepare the question in order to establish the cause of this. So in this way, we cannot establish what is the cause, and we cannot accuse somebody. This is
Yeah, so the first step that the organizers asked me to speak on was this: the official reports, are they valid? Are they true? And so we've established, I believe, that the official reports are not true. They are not valid. They're not scientific. And then from there, we're left, as you said, without an answer. We need an answer. We need people with expertise to help us understand what actually did happen. And a lot of people use the term demolition fairly loosely. There's a lot of, I can assume, a lot of ways to demolish buildings if that was the case. There are professionals around the world who have said that does very much look like what has happened. There was a Dutch demolition expert by the name of Danny Jowenko who made it very clear, one of Europe's top demolition companies, this was a demolition. At the time, he didn't know this was the World Trade Center. He just saw this. Yes, that's a demolition. Hugo Bachmann is a structural engineering professor at ETH, a Swiss institute, ETH. And he said, of course, that's a demolition. But he can't tell you either, I don't think, exactly how they did it. Certainly can't say who did it. That still remains to be done, that work. And hopefully you'll help us recommend how to move forward.
Thank you.
Yeah, Professor Lee.
Yes. I think I have a strategy that might be the point of entry for us getting this thing moving again. One of the sticking points when you explain the demolition or of these buildings to people is they come back to you and say, well, this would require that these buildings were rigged with explosives, and how could that possibly be happening if there's fully occupied buildings with thousands, if not tens of thousands of workers going in and out of the building every day? Now, it turns out that there was a power down in the days before the collapse of the buildings, and there was work being done on the core. But I'm surprised that there hasn't been a great deal more attention paid to what was exactly going on in those power downs. I'm wondering if you could comment on that.
Yeah, in the weeks before 9/11, there were these power downs. I don't have a lot of information about those. In addition to that, there was an elevator renovation project going on in the 9 months before 9/11 throughout 2001. We know the company's name was Ace Elevator. It went bankrupt afterwards, shortly afterward. We also know that a very interesting coincidence occurred with the towers, in that the few floors that had just recently been upgraded for fireproofing was exactly where the planes impacted and the fires occurred. In the North Tower, it was exact. The 8 floors that had been fully upgraded for fireproofing, floors 93 through 100, where it was exactly where the plane impacted. So the point there is, to not be too imaginative, but just to make the point, is that when the floors were down for fireproofing upgrade, the steel structure was made available, obviously, to apply the fireproofing. The building the floors were taken out of use, at least in sections, and the steel structure was made available. This was in just the 2 years before 9/11. So there's a number of possibilities for when the access could have occurred, but it's somewhat speculative at this point. And I don't know too much about the power downs.
But it does suggest that this could be a fruitful area of research going forward, because there should be, in the record, there should be building permits and all kinds of news, and even people from from former workers who survived the 9/11 who say, oh yes, I remember there was a team of workers working on 4 floors where, we had to get out or what. So I think there should be some inquiries initiated on that score.
Yes, some of that work has already been in progress. FOIA requests have been submitted. Responses have been received in many cases from the Port Authority who control the buildings and so forth, that those records no longer exist. In other cases, we do get a few records here and there and may piece together, for example, 1 or 2 of the companies involved in the fireproofing upgrades. But there's a lot of work to do, as you suggested.
Professor Jenkins.
I think it would be very helpful to us in trying to think about this if we could get some kind of a reasonable lower bound estimate of how many man-hours would be required to rig these buildings to be consistent with what we observed with their demolition. And we also have to, if we're going to find access, which consistent with whatever that estimate of man-hours is, we have to do it for the 3 buildings. It's not enough to say there was a power outage on certain floors in one of the towers or both of the towers. We'd have to ask the question, was access available as well in World Trade Center 7? But I think perhaps we need as much information as we can get from people who know about demolition, and perhaps who know about demolition with sophisticated superthermite, to instruct us about at least the lower bound, so we can think more realistically about these matters.
I agree.
Other questions? Judge?
No, that's fine.
No, I want to ask you for curiosity. In our penal procedure, we have an instrument of search the truth. This is the judicial experiment, which consists in the repetition of the fact in the same or similar situation with the same material, the same temperature. So I ask you, it is possible in the little way to repeat this experiment with creating the same situation in order to establish if it is possible with this temperature, the collapse of the building. It is clear? No.
Yes,
It is different from expertise.
that's right.
We must create one situation similar, if it is possible, and so you can establish if with this temperature
Yeah.
the same building can collapse.
That's a very good point, Judge, if I understand you correctly. You're suggesting that perhaps we find a way to do some of the physical testing that the U.S. government agency did not do. For example, we could build some floor assemblies with floor beams and concrete slabs and see what kind of differential expansion there would be. We could, we could build floor assemblies and sag them and see what kind of inward pull there would be. And we could just, instead of just theoretically, we could very clearly prove that that's not possible. So that may be one of your recommendations, and I would agree with that.
Thank you.
Yes. Yeah, Professor Johnson.
Mr. Ryan, you have used some very strong language here, fraud and similar terms. We expect engineers as good professionals to be ethical. And there seems to be some question here whether this behavior on the part of engineers in NIST is unethical. We have been asked to look at a variety of conclusions about what we are seeing. Would you, and perhaps this question should be directed to an attorney, would you say that there is some evidence of criminal behavior here that we should be looking at?
Yeah, and I'm going to have to speak from my own opinion. I'm looking at the attorney right now, and he's shaking his head, no, Kevin. But so I'll tell you my experience then. My experience 7 years ago was after having spent a year asking the top managers in my company how this could happen, given the fire resistance information we gave them and the result. How could this happen? And no one knowing the answer, I wrote directly to the National Institute of Standards and Technology and allowed those questions to become public, was fired from that. And then, even then, it took me quite a while to even begin considering the explanation of demolition or speak about it publicly. It wasn't until Professor Stephen Jones from Utah began speaking about that publicly, and his nature is such that it, for some reason, it was okay for him to do that. And the rest of us kind of said, oh, well, if he can do it, we can, and we'll start looking and talking about that. And then the word fraud, which I did use at least twice, I think, I'll stand by that word, given what I presented today, and given the 7 years that has passed, and my attempts to speak to these scientists in the government without response, our attempts to speak with them and collaborate with them and gain understanding with them, and their responses or lack of response thereof, and then the reports they've generated, have led me to that word. I think that may be where I need to stop with that.
Yes, Professor Lee.
Some years ago, the owner of the buildings, a man named Larry Silverstein, was quoted as saying, and I'm sure half the people in the room are familiar with this quote, was saying, well, when talking about Building 7, he said, well, there had been so much loss of life that we decided to pull the building. And of course, a great deal was made for a while of that quote, and what exactly was meant by it. And it seemed there was a certain amount of weaseling around, you know, and what did he actually mean by that? And obviously, your evidence is of an entirely different nature on the physical, chemical evidence. But would you comment on what was Larry Silverstein saying?
Yes, I will, mainly because I think this is a very interesting linguistic sort of a challenge here in terms of discussing this with people who support the official story. And I'll say that in that you, Professor Lee, said, Mr. Silverstein said, we decided to pull it.
Right.
The truth is that Mr. Silverstein said they decided to pull
They
it.
decided.
He was talking about the fire commanders.
Right.
They decided to pull it. Okay, and when I made the same mistake that you did once, saying we decided to pull it, the response was just, you know, attacking. Just the people supporting the official story. I can't believe you used that wrong pronoun we instead of they. That's funny to some extent because the response now to Silverstein's statement, they decided to pull it, is that it refers to a group of firefighters. Right? So
Or
that's,
so they claim.
that's the claim. They decided to pull it, meaning it being a large group of firefighters in the building. Of course, the problem with that is there were no firefighters in the building at that time. But and then we watched the building come down.
Please hold your comment. Thank you.
But again, the pronoun challenge is interesting to me. Maybe I'm off on a tangent. People can criticize those of us questioning the official story on the smallest things, but yet come up with these explanations. It refers to a large group of people that are at least as absurd, if and intentional, in that sense. I don't know if that helps in any way. Other than that, I don't know. I believe that pull it does mean, I think it does have something to do with bringing the building down by way of an intentional means.
Right.
But that's just my opinion. I don't know for sure.
Yeah. Yes, Professor Jenkins.
Well, I find this Silverstein quote extremely disturbing and puzzling. What he said apparently was addressed to a fire commander of the New York Fire Department. This commander has just witnessed the death of several hundred of his firemen in the first two towers. And are we to believe that he is now complicit in the demolition of World Trade 7? And could he, I mean, if the fire department says they are going to pull it, when would they have prepared the building to be pulled? And these are really deep puzzles to me. Talk about cognitive dissonance. I have a lot of it.
Yeah, all I could say about that is with the reports that we've been given, it's a tangled web that's been woven.
Yes.
And we have a lot to work through to come to the truth. It's always best, I think, to leave a lot of the statements and you know, ancillary evidence and things that can be interpreted one way or another alone and focus on the things that can't be denied, like the laws of Sir Isaac Newton. And you know, if we continually do that, and you're going to find over the next few days more irrefutable physical facts, more irrefutable things that aren't left to interpretation, that I think will help. They won't answer all the questions, Professor Jenkins, that you've just asked, but they'll help set us on the right track.
Yeah.
I want to refer back briefly to the conversation we had just before the break when the audience was participating. And I thought that they were sharpening the point that we seem to be able, perhaps it's a fault of the way our mind works, to deny certain brutal facts if we haven't got an intelligible context in which to put those facts. And I'm afraid that that's one of the obstacles we face. We have to walk some kind of a fine line between generating an intelligible context that is one that says this is feasible. A rational person can imagine how this could be done. That's one side of this line. The other side is spinning out detailed, fanciful, easily discredited narratives. And what I'm saying is we need to show that the essential elements of the positive account, which is implied by the failure of the official story, it's strongly implied, it's inextricably connected to it. That is, that if it didn't come down from the airplanes, it had to come down from demolition. Who could have done it? How could it have been done? Those essential elements have to be made plausible without getting ourselves into this discredited fantasy life about the exact nature in which the thing was pulled off.
If I can suggest something, this is out of my field, but Professor DeHaven Smith might have something to say about it. I wonder if these reports in themselves can be considered a state crime against democracy. A false explanation, apparently an intentionally false explanation for a major crime. I don't know, but I would think that would be worth considering whether or not that in itself is a state crime against democracy. Outside of who committed the crimes, the actual crimes of 9/11, because the official stories, the false stories, have resulted in the deaths of many more people, in my view, than the crimes of 9/11 did.
Beg pardon, gentlemen. On that note, we're about at 4:15, and we might stop with the cross-examination, as it were, of our witness, Kevin Ryan, and move into our final session, which is your full participation